Good morning. 3.5 years ago, in March of 2013, Cardinal Jorge Maria Bergoglio was named Pope, the 266th Pope of the Catholic Church. It was a day of tremendous joy here at Jesuit when all of us realized that we were going to have a Jesuit Pope. It was a cause for celebration, and the current seniors almost certainly remember this. Local news networks descended on campus to interview Jesuit students about what it means now that we have a Jesuit Pope. There were these big papal banners hung up in St. Anthony's Chapel. It was a really cool week or so. And then we heard that Cardinal Bergoglio, who is from Argentina, we heard he was taking the name Francis. And all of I don't want to speak for everybody else, but I know I certainly assumed that Jesuit Pope Francis, I thought it was going to be a reference to St. Francis Xavier, the great heroic Jesuit missionary who traveled all over the world, may have personally converted more people to Christianity than any single person in history. I was wrong, as it turns out. It was not Pope Francis as in St. Francis Xavier. It was Pope Francis as in St. Francis of Assisi, a Jesuit Pope taking the name of St. Francis. There's a story that's since come out about why Pope Francis perhaps took that name. Before he was officially announced as the Pope, the story goes that the cardinal sitting next to him in the Sistine Chapel when the votes were being counted, the cardinal sitting next to him kind of elbowed him a little bit and whispered in his ear, "Remember the poor." For those of you who don't know anything about St. Francis of Assisi, he's one of the greatest saints of the Catholic Church. He, early in his life, might as well have been a student at Jesuit high school. He was from a middle-class, upper-middle-class family. Ambitious parents who made sacrifices to give him a good education, wanted to set him up for success in the world. And then, late teens, early 20s or so, Francis decided he didn't want that. I'll give you the short version, but Francis ended up renouncing everything. This all culminated at one point when, in the middle of the town square of Assisi, he took off his clothes, basically standing there in his underwear. He renounced his possessions. He even renounced his father's name because he didn't want that life. He wanted to serve the poor. And this spirit has defined the pontificate of St. Francis, or Pope Francis. This idea of remembering the poor, of being a Jesuit Pope with a Franciscan streak. Why is this so important to Pope Francis? Why is this so important to the Church today? And why should this be so important to you? St. Francis believed, as Pope Francis believes, that when you touch the poor, you touch Christ. Making contact with the poor is like making contact with Christ. It is the same thing. This is an appropriate thing to reflect on at the beginning of the school year. It's easy to get caught up in the fun of Welcome Week. It's easy to fall into the routine of a football game this week, Blue Tide, practices, studying for quizzes and tests. We're now a few weeks into the school year. Making plans for the long weekend already, I'm sure some people are. But in the midst of all of this, in the midst of all of our plans and all of our hustle and bustle, we have to remember the poor. We try. We say the prayer for generosity a lot. to give and not to count the cost. I suppose one of the implications is that would be to give to the poor. Yesterday's readings in Mass are a good reminder. The Psalm, God in your goodness you have made home for the poor. At the end of the Gospel, Jesus said that when you hold a lunch or a dinner, do not invite your friends or your brothers or your relatives or your wealthy neighbors, because they might be able to repay you. Rather, when you hold a banquet, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind. Blessed indeed will you be because of their inability to repay you. So at the beginning of this school year, and I'm sure Coach Wood, as Director of Community Service, will have plenty more to say about this as the year evolves. How will you directly help the poor this year, both to fulfill your community service requirement for Jesuit, but also to fulfill your obligation as a Catholic or as a Christian or as a disciple? Some of you have already started to do this, whether it was mission trips over the summer. Maybe some of you have already begun your service. Key Club has already begun to meet, and other clubs as well. A lot of people contributed to the Welcome Week clothing drive. On Wednesday, in Convocation, we will be delivering the proceeds from the Welcome Week clothing drive to the charity that directly clothes the homeless. It's a charity run by an alumnus of Jesuit High School, Andre Kerwan. You'll see him. He'll be here on Wednesday to receive the proceeds from the Welcome Week clothing drive. Which, by the way, if you still have clothes, you still have time to bring them in. Mrs. Pacheco brought some in on Friday. Even over the weekend, I got to see some of my old friends from Jesuit. I knew I was getting together with them. I got 3 trash bags of clothes in my trunk. My Jesuit alumni friends brought some of their clothes for the Welcome Week drive. As we go through the year and as we close with the prayer of St. Francis of Assisi, much like Francis sitting there in the Sistine Chapel, imagine somebody tapping you on the shoulder and whispering in your ear, "Remember the poor. Don't forget the poor." Please bow your heads for prayer.